Richard Gwynn, in his biography of you, says that between 1925 and 1945, when you returned from abroad, that your life was not a success, at least compared to the period earlier than that, and the period after that. And he says it's a mystery. Can you help us solve the mystery? Do you consider that period between roughly 1925 and 1945 not a successful period for you?
I would consider the whole period of my life. From the day as a young fellow of 15, I came out of Bishopfield College and went and got a job for myself at the Plain Dealer printing office. Practically to today, and I'm now 83, or almost 83. For that whole period, my life has been a failure, unquestionably a failure, not from every point of view, but from the great point of view of material success. I have been a failure. There have been intervals in between every now and then for a year or 2 or 3 or 4 years when I had a good job or I had fairly good pay, but that would be exceptional. I didn't particularly want that kind of success. Indeed, I had a lot of contempt for it. And I'm afraid a considerable amount of contempt for the people who wanted that kind of success and people who had it. It did not impress me. I have never in my entire life felt any need to have money, to have lots of money. Never felt any need to have money to sustain me and my pride and my confidence. I have, not having 2 coppers to rub against each other, I have not lacked confidence. I've never depended on the possession of money, having money in my pocket or in the form of a check. I've never needed that. I've never depended on that. I depended on it to buy food, to pay my rent, to pay my board, yes. But I never depended on money to give me the kind of strength of character, the strength of personality that a man needs to have. I didn't think ever that that depended on how much money I had. And so I could be as poor as a church mouse, and I often was. In fact, I was as poor as a church mouse for more years of my life up to now than when I was not that poor. So success to me never meant affluence. It never meant having a lot of money. It never meant being rich. It never depended on how much money I had. Now, I had a certain amount of greed, however, but it was not greed for money. I had a certain amount of determination to accumulate wealth, but the wealth that I was determined to accumulate was not money. Now, you could say that the great industrial and commercial and financial empires that have been built in the world were never built by people like that. Perhaps they built other kinds of empires, but not industrial, not financial, not commercial. To build that kind of empire, you surely must have a desire, a powerful desire to make money, lots of it, pile on top of the other. You must surely have that if you're going to be a commercial and a financial or industrial success. But while I did not have the desire to pile up money, to accumulate money, to save money, I never saved any. Even when I had it, I didn't save it. I had no desire to save money. I had no desire to accumulate it, you see. it went as fast as I got it. Sometimes it went faster than I got it, and I would go in debt. But I had greed just the same. I had a powerful greed, and the greed that I had was a greed not for money, but for adventures, for experiences. I was able to console myself. I didn't need to strive hard, struggle hard to console myself, but I was able always to console myself no matter how low down I got in my luck, in my worldly possessions. I was always able always to console myself with the thought, I'm depositing in the bank. I'm making deposits all the time. I never cease, I never stop making deposits in the bank. But not the bank of money, the bank of cash, but the bank of experience, the bank of adventure. I had a conscious determination, and the word was determination, not just a desire. Well, it was a determined desire to accumulate experiences. The more people I met, the different kinds and the more kinds of people, the more adventures I had and the greater variety of adventures, the all kinds of experiences, and the more there were and the more varied they were, the happier I was, because this was enabling me to keep piling up a fortune in the bank of experience. I was putting my deposits regularly, constantly, steadily. I was depositing in the bank of experiences, all kinds of experiences. And when I got broke one time in New York, about 1921 or 22, when I was 21 or 22 years old, and decided to leave St. John's again and go to New York for the second time, I managed to scrape up enough money to pay my passage by boat to New York, and to pay my board. I got a room in a rooming house, not a boarding house, but a rooming house, and to pay the room rent, which was probably $5 or $6 a week, for 2 or 3 weeks. And in the hope that I would get a job before that time expired, and I'd begin to earn money, and I did not get the job. I didn't get it for another 3 or 4 or 5 weeks after the first 3 weeks expired. And what was the result? The result was that I could manage somehow to stay in the room for another week, maybe a total of 4 weeks. And it was going to be about 2 weeks or so before I would begin to earn some money. I got a job. I got one of the most wonderful jobs of my whole life. Since I've been born in this world, one of the greatest jobs I got during that period. It was as a reporter on the New York Times, which undoubtedly, I think, and probably undoubtedly was the greatest newspaper in the world, even greater than the Times of London. Not so prestigious, not so famous, but a greater newspaper. And I got a job, but the job wasn't to mature, wasn't to come into effect for 2 or 3 weeks, you see. But here I was with not enough money to pay my room rent. And I went out the first night. I was out. I carried a razor, a Gillette razor in my pocket, you know. And that's about all I needed was a razor. And I would go to the public library at 5th Avenue and 42nd Street, where I lived there for years, off and on, you know. And there you'd have a washroom to go to, and I'd shave there. But night, the library would close, 10 o'clock or 10:30 at night, and I had to find somewhere to sleep. And I went to a DOS house. And I remember the one I went to. I could take you there right now. I don't know if that building is still there. It's about a 4-story building. And you paid $1 a night for a room. But after I had been there a couple or 3 nights, it was cutting too deeply into my money. Then I found a cheaper DOS house where it was 75 cents a night. Then I found a cheaper one where it was 50 cents a night. Well, do you think for one moment that caused my confidence to reduce, to lessen? No way. That was about as low as you could get, except for one more step, and I had to go that one more step. When I didn't have enough money to go to a doss house and get a bunk to sleep in for the night, and you had to pay in advance when you went in. When I ran out of enough, because I had to save enough 10 cents a morning for my breakfast. You could get breakfast then in New York for 10 cents, and you could get a meal in the middle of the day for 20 cents, you know, and you get dinner at night for 30, that's 50, 60 cents a day. You could live, you see. You had to save enough money for food, and you couldn't go wasting it on a bed. And when I got down to that point, I went to a place where I had seen men sleeping. Bryant, B-R-Y-A-N-T, Bryant Park. Bryant Park is named after William Cullen Bryant, the great American author. They called the park adjoining the big public library, the 42nd Street Public Library. It faced onto Fifth Avenue, it went along 42nd, and behind it is Bryant Park. And there they have a lot of marble benches. No arms on them, no back, just a flat marble slab, you see. And I had seen men sleeping there. I had seen that. And it was in the summer, and the weather was warm. And I had noticed that they had picked up newspapers and used them as sort of pillows. Well, I said, if they can do it, I can do it. And I slept more than one night. Now, one day, this university, or maybe even the government of the province, will go to New York and identify that marble bench that I slept on and put a slab on it and say, here slept Joey Smallwood. I tell you, literally, having money, not having money, never made any difference in my estimation of myself. I never felt poor because I had no money. I would have felt poor if I had no brains, if I had no education, if I had no knowledge, if I had no information. If I weren't reading for 25 or 30 years of my life an average of a book a day, every day, for 25 or 30 years of my life, if I weren't reading a book a day, if there weren't days when I read 2 books in one day, and if there wasn't just one day, there was only one in my life that I can recall, one day when I read 3 books in that one day. But that was crossing the Atlantic on an old tramp ship, and I had got free passage on her from the late Albert E. Hickman. A.E. Hickman. The name of the firm is A.E. Hickman and Company. Well, A.E. Hickman was Albert E. Hickman, and he had been the leader of the Liberal Party, and we were friends. And I got a free trip. I wanted to go to England. I couldn't afford to pay my way. And on the way over, I hardly got out of the bunk, you know. And I read and read and read and read, because that's been my main hobby throughout my life. That's why I didn't need money to have confidence in myself, to have confidence in my fate, in my destiny. So it's perfectly true, as Richard Gwynne says, but he could have gone a step further. He said, what, between the age of 25 and 45, was it? Well, that's only 10 years. That's only a little scrap of my life. You could say that just about of my entire life. To this day, I am a poor man today, and I'm in my 83rd year. I don't need to be poor. I still have a pension from the House of Assembly. After all, I was a member of the House for 23 years. I was a minister. I was a minister of the Crown for 23 years. I was the Premier of the province for 23 years. And thanks to Mr. Frank Moores, who succeeded me as Premier, and who, while he was Premier, never thinking that he would one day need a pension, but perhaps thinking only about poor old Joey with a pension of $8,000 or $9,000 a year, you know. He should do something about that, and he brought in legislation to the House of Assembly to increase the pension of premiers, not me by name now, but premiers. Now that automatically would include him, and it would include anyone who succeeded him. It includes Mr. Peckford now because he has succeeded Frank Moores. He brought in a new law increasing the premier's pension to around $16,000, $17,000 a year. I today am getting a pension from the House of Assembly, from the government of Newfoundland, as an ex-member, as an ex-minister, as an ex-premier for 23 years. I'm getting a pension today which is within a few $1,000s. It's not as much, but a few $1,000s more. And that's what all the members of the House get, whether they're ministers or not. And the Premier today gets, I would say, between 4 and 5 times as much salary a year as Premier as I got. But when he finally retires, voluntarily or involuntarily, when he finally retires, he will draw a nice pension thanks to his predecessor, my successor, Frank Moores, who brought in a law increasing the pension for premiers. Now I'm getting a very good pension. It's $16,000 or $17,000 a year. And I'm getting Canada's famous old age pension. And I'm getting the Canada pension. Now that's my income. It was more than that. I'll tell you about that sometime. But my total income today is all in the form of pensions from the House of Assembly, from the Government of Canada to old age pension and Canada pension. It's a total of $23,000 or $24,000 a year. Now I could live comfortably on that. I wouldn't be able to travel as much as I'd like to travel because I dearly love travel. I dearly love it. It's the second love of my life to travel all over the earth and see people and places and things. And I never do that without thinking to myself, God in heaven, what a shame it is. What a pity that every Newfoundlander can't go to China, to Japan, can't go to Hong Kong, can't go to India, can't go to Pakistan, can't go to Bangkok in Thailand, can't go to Turkey, can't go to Israel, can't go to all these countries. What a shame, what a pity it is. They're living only a quarter of a life. To live a full life, everybody should be able to go to all those lands and see all those people and all those wonderful things. That's the second great passion of my life. And so my income now, if I weren't fooling around publishing books, if I weren't spending my income to help meet the costs of printing books, because that's become a very costly business, very costly business. If I weren't doing that, I could live pretty comfortably. But do you think that I feel one bit less worthy, that I feel one bit less worthwhile, that I feel one scrap less competent and less capable and less important because I haven't got as much money as, say, a member of the House of Assembly today, a backbench member has, who's been there 2 or 3 or 4 years against my 23 years? No, I don't feel inferior to anybody that I know on this earth, except, and now he's dead, Bertrand Russell. I felt very inferior to Bertrand Russell, very inferior to Winston Churchill, very inferior to Mackenzie King. I feel today very inferior to Pierre Elliott Trudeau. I feel inferior to some of the great intellects and the great minds and the great personalities and the great souls? Do you think I feel equal to Pius XII, to John XXIII, to the Archbishop of Canterbury, to the evangelist, the American evangelist Billy Graham? No, no. There are men in the world to whom I feel very, very inferior. But the men to whom I feel inferior are not the millionaires. The lack of money has never for a moment since I was born influenced my thinking, except this. When I didn't have money and I wanted it to publish a book, to pay the cost of printing a book, then I felt the lack of it acutely. But not even then did I feel inferior. Not at all. My confidence does not now any more than it ever did depend on possessing money.
The kind of experiences then that you deposited in your bank of experience, have ranged, I guess, through the whole zodiac of experience, from sleeping on a park bench in New York to palaces in other parts of the world. How could you say the experiences before you went into politics, or at least before you were elected to political office, were valuable in getting you there?
Of course. That's all I had. When we won Confederation, and the government of Canada appointed a lieutenant governor, that happened to be Sir Albert Walsh. The first thing that Sir Albert Walsh had to do was call on someone to form a government. And he called on me and he said, Mr. Smallwood, would you undertake to form a cabinet, a government? Yes, Sir Albert. Yes, of course I would. And I did. And I formed the government. Well, what did I bring to that job? I didn't bring any great education. I wasn't a doctor of philosophy. I became a doctor 10 times over after that, after I became premier, 10 universities, recognizing the marvelous erudition and the marvelous scholarship and the marvelous knowledge that I had. We won't say now in what. I had a great knowledge of park benches, I had a great knowledge of doss houses, and I had a great knowledge of trade unions and co-op societies. I had visited 1,000 of our 1,300 communities that we had in Newfoundland then, before centralization, before resettlement. 1,300 communities, and I visited 1,000 of them. I brought that with me to the job of becoming premier in 1949. I had formed unions, I had led strikes, I had formed cooperative societies, I had written books, I had published books. I had gained an enormous amount of practical down-to-earth experience, That's all I brought with me. I wasn't a businessman. I wasn't a merchant. I had no money. But these things were sort of useful, in a premier. I said the second, or was it the third time a university made me a doctor. It was in Ontario, in Waterloo. And I had to make a speech. And I told them that I wouldn't be here today. You wouldn't be honoring me and making me a doctor, because I wouldn't be Premier of Newfoundland today, but for my experience. And the biggest experience I brought with me to the job of Premier, the biggest experience I brought with me was rearing pigs. I had a piggery out at Gander during the war. It was a big piggery, yes. It had a lot of pigs, 600-700 pigs. It was the biggest piggery in eastern Canada at that time. And I learned an awful lot about life, especially about pigs, both kinds. Those with 4 legs and those with 2. I learned a lot about pigs, and I would say that no man or woman should ever become Premier of Newfoundland without having fed pigs shoveled out after them. No one should become premier without having gone out on the marshes picking marsh berries. No one out on the barrens who hasn't gone out on the barrens day after day picking blueberries, and then in the fall picking partridge berries. If you haven't done humble things like that, how can you be a plain, common-sensed individual? It's so easy for you to get swell-headed. It's so easy, and when you get swell-headed, you're removed a mile or two away from the common, to use a vulgarity that I learned from a very erudite man, one of the most eloquent speakers we've ever had in Newfoundland, a great lawyer, Gordon Bradley, when he referred to the ordinary, what Abraham Lincoln called the common people. You remember Abraham Lincoln said that God must have loved the common people. He made so many of them. Gordon Bradley, instead of saying common people, used to refer to the ragged-arsed artillery. The ragged-arsed artillery. The first time he said that, that struck me as what a marvelous expression. And if you don't go into the premiership of Newfoundland, and you might say any other province of Canada, or any nation, any country in the world, if you don't go in to the premiership of that, or the presidency, with a good, rough and ready, working, practical knowledge of the ragged-arsed artillery, the common people, you're going to get swell-headed. You're going to go off the rails. So while I didn't bring a great erudition and great scholarship, although I had produced, I think it was 7 or 8 books, not every Newfoundlander, since Newfoundland began, has produced 7 or 8 books. I produced 20. But I had produced 7 or 8 or 9 the day before I became premier. And though I didn't bring any great erudition, great scholarship with me, I did bring into that job more knowledge of a certain kind than any other Newfoundlander perhaps had or ever had. That's a big boast. That's a very strong boast, but there's a lot of strength in it, a lot of truth in that. And this is what is important because, all power corrupts. How's it go? All power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. You can't become premier of a province with all your party in the House of Assembly and your followers all around the province looking to you for leadership. Your cabinet ministers hardly ever deciding to take this step or make this decision without coming and discussing it with you. You can't be in that job more than 3 or 5, 4 or 8 or 10 years without being in terrible danger of feeling that you're a little tin god. You're marvelous. And so you can get swell-headed. That's terribly easy to do. I don't think I grew to have ever more confidence the more I got to know, the more experience I gained, the more I traveled around the world, and the more I met with some of the great statesmen of the whole world, which I did, the more confidence I would have in myself and in my judgment. Now therein, of course, lay a certain amount of danger. But what Richard Gwynne said that you've quoted is correct, but it's only partly correct. He said from the ages of 25 to 35, 45, that's 20 years, is it? That in those 20 years, I didn't seem to be very successful. Well, if the production of 7 or 8 books, now Richard has produced 3 books, 4 books. He's produced 4 books. And that's his career, that's his life. That's all he knows how to do is write books. And he's produced 4, and they're magnificent books. One of them is a book about me. One is a book about Trudeau. and so on. I produced, I don't know whether it was somewhere between 7 and 10 books before I became Premier. They weren't all world shakers, but 2 of them were bestsellers. I produced 2 bestsellers before I became Premier at all. And altogether I produced 10 bestsellers, you know. 10. That's no slouch. Nevertheless, he's right, but he's wrong that he made it only 20 years. I have been a failure in this life, in his sense of the word, for not 20 years, but for 83.
When you returned to Newfoundland from abroad in the 20s, what had you intended to do? Had you any specific plans or goals in mind?
Well, yes, I have a very specific plan. John P. Burke. John P. Burke was a labor leader in the United States. He was the permanent secretary-treasurer of the International Brotherhood of Pulp, Sulfite, and Paper Mill Workers. And that union went all over North America. But there weren't all that many paper mills and pulp mills, and so the grand total membership of that International Brotherhood was quite small, maybe 10 or 15, maybe 20,000 members in the United States, Canada, and Newfoundland. And he was the head of it. He'd been the head of it for donkey's years. He was so highly respected in the American labor movement that he would have become the president of the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. But his union, his brotherhood was too small. But he and I were close friends. He was a socialist. And he used to come down to, he lived in Fort Edward, upstate in New York. And he'd come down to New York City about once a month, and he'd phone me right away. He'd get in touch, and we'd go out for a walk. And I remember one time, we were walking up Fifth Avenue. We came to St. Patrick's Cathedral, big Roman Catholic cathedral. And we went in. It was hot. It was burning hot sun. And we went in to get cool, you know. We sat down in the cool of this magnificent, this glorious cathedral. And I said, John, you're a Catholic, aren't you? He said, yeah, yes I am. At least he said I was born one and baptized. I said, what do you mean, aren't you one now? Well, he said, not very ardent, no. I said, aren't you? He said, no. He said, my mother would hate to hear that. I haven't told her that. But he says, I'm not as interested as I used to be. But he said, I do love to come in and sit here and just commune. I love that. Well, I said, boy, you're still, you've got a religious instinct in you. He said, oh, sure I have, yes. Anyway, we became great friends, and then one day he told me that he was worried about the local branch of his brotherhood in Grand Falls, Newfoundland. And here was I, a Newfoundlander, and his friend, and his union in Grand Falls. He said, you know, that local is right down low. It's only got 400 members. He said it had 2,100. And they had a big strike in 1921, and their membership has gone away off. He said, would you go down and reorganize Local 63? Well, I said, John, I wasn't thinking just yet of going back, but he talked me into it. And the pay was $40-something a week, which was a little fortune. Back then, you know, 1920, what was it, 27 or 26 or 28, somewhere around there. Anyway, to make a long story short, back I went, only to discover that instead of 300 or 400 members, they were down to about 60 or 70 members. So I got hold of the officers, and I set in. And I built that local up again. And when I did, Burke, you know, kept writing me, and I had to keep reporting to him. He said, now I want you to go to Corner Brook. Oh, this tells me when it was. I came back to Grand Falls about 1924. That's when it was, 1924. And I went on to Corner Brook, 1924 or 25, and I formed Local 64 of the same brotherhood in the mill at Corner Brook. And that was the same year when I finished that job. I got sort of enticed into one of the toughest jobs I ever tackled in all my life. That was part of the years, the unsuccessful years that Richard Gwynne speaks of, between the ages of 25 and 45. I got enticed into getting on a train and going to Port aux Basques, and from Port aux Basques walking to St. John's on the railway track, and on the branch lines. The first one was down to Lewisport, and the next one was down to Bonavista, and the next one was down to Heart's Content, and I walked across the Barrens. I didn't, I got a run. I got a run with a Carbonear man who was a butcher, and he used to go over Hogan the butcher in Carbonear, and his daughter Nora, I think it was Nora, was the manager of the big movie theater up on Queens up on Lamarche Road, up Military Road. Well, he had a butcher shop, and he had customers in Heart's Content, and he'd go over there once a week with a big with a horse and a square body wagon, and deliver meat. And on his way back, he gave me a lift, and I came back to Carbonear. Well, in that 1 year, 1925 it was, I reorganized Local 63 in Grand Falls in the paper mill there. I organized Local 64 in the mill at Corner Brook. I walked from Port aux Basques to St. John's, and I saved the section men. There were about 600 section men. You know what a section man is? Well, the railway line from Port aux Basques to St. John's was divided into sections of anything from 6 to 10 miles in length, each section. And there were 4 men, section men to a section, a foreman and 3 section men. And they had been getting 25 cents an hour pay. And that spring, the railway had cut them back to 22.5 cents an hour. And they came to me. I was the big union man organizing the big new local in the mill at Corner Brook. And they came to me, and in fact, one of the foremen, the 4 men, the foreman was a Jacotar. That's part French, part English. And he spoke with an accent. He said, "You are Mr. Smallwood?" I said, "Yes, that's right." He said, "You are the big union man?" I said, "I'm the union man." He said, "You formed the big union in the mill in Corner Brook?" I said, "Yes, I'm the man." He said, "Why you not form a union for us men?" I said, Who do you mean? Who is us?" He said, us section men. I said, "What do you want a union for?" He said, "They treat us very badly." I said, how badly do they treat you?" He said, we get 25 cents an hour for the men, and 30 cents for the foreman. I get 30 cents, and my 3 men, they get 25 cents. And last spring, they cut us. They cut me back to 25 cents, and they cut the men back to 22.5 cents. And he said, "This is not fair." I said, "God in heaven, we have men working today for 22. He said, "There were 600 of us." So I had to do it, and I walked myself down to 1 cantle in weight. You know something funny? If there are 100,000 people listening to this at this minute in Newfoundland, do you know that out of the 100,000, there'll probably be 90,000 or more who won't know what the word kentle means? Kentle is in English hundredweight, and a hundredweight is 112 pounds. And always, for hundreds of years, codfish, salt codfish, was weighed by the kentle. Kentles, quarters, and pounds. You know, 10 kentles, 3/4, that's 3/4 of a kentle, and 15 pounds, kentles, quarters, and pounds. I walked myself down on that walk. It took me 3 months. I walked myself down to 1 kentle, 112 pounds.
When you started
But look, there was no success in that except to stop the wage cut. I did succeed in stopping the wage cut. So Gwyn is absolutely right. That was part of those 20 years. And everything else that I did in those 20 years didn't amount to a row of beans. Not even a half a row of beans in the sense that he meant it. I was not a success. But I was.
When you set out on something, a mission like that, I guess one of the best ways of describing it is a mission. It walk across the whole country, as it was.
Yeah. After that, you know, after I walked across the railway track across Newfoundland, I built a road across there. And not only did I build a road right from St. John's to Port aux Basques, but I drove the first car that ever drove across Newfoundland. I'm the one that drove it. And from the minute I left at Confederation Building till I landed in Port aux Basques, I never took my hand off that wheel while she was moving. We'd sleep in the night and I wouldn't sleep in the car with my hand holding the wheel. But while that car was moving, every inch from St. John's to Port aux Basques, I drove it. Greg Power was with me in the car. Bill Callahan, the publisher of the Daily News, and a bunch of newsmen and radio men were along with me. And not only did I drive the first car, it was a Land Rover, which I still have. I have that Land Rover. It's down in the White Elephant. You know where the White Elephant is? Yeah. In Fort Pepperell. A huge building that we took over, I took over when I was Premier, for the Department of Highways, for trucks and cars and buses and so on. It's down there now, stored, and I'm afraid they vandalized it a little bit, but it's there. And one of these days I'm going to take it back when I find, what I want to do, I'll tell you what I want to do. This is the first motor vehicle that ever crossed Newfoundland. I owned it. It was mine. It was my property. It didn't belong to the government. It has never belonged to the government. It has never ceased to belong to me. It's mine. That's why I drove it. It was mine, because I had a dream that someday, perhaps in front of Confederation Building or somewhere, the government would build a big concrete block, and they would mount this Land Rover car right on top of that block, the first motor vehicle ever to cross Newfoundland. Now, if they want to put a statue of me on top of the Land Rover, I won't object. I won't be around to object anyway. Now, in addition to that, I walked across Newfoundland. I drove the first car across Newfoundland. In addition to that, I led a procession of cars and trucks and buses and vehicles of all kinds. The biggest in all Newfoundland's history. I led the way from St. John's to Port aux Basques, and halfway across the island, we had the Prime Minister of Canada come there, and I had built a great column. We call it the Pearson Pillar, which is roughly halfway across the island, and he flew down and drove out to the pillar and drew the flag across and made a speech. And then he went back to Ottawa, and I kept on going to Port aux Basques, leading the biggest motorcade, cavalcade ever to cross Newfoundland. That's 3 times I crossed Newfoundland in a very special kind of way. I've crossed it scores and scores of times, but 3 very special ways. Yeah.
Just to spend a little time on the walking trip across Newfoundland, what did you actually do to prepare for that, to actually start the physical trip? I mean, you weren't a woodsman.
Well, yeah, that's easy to answer. Until I got to Grand Falls Station, don't let me forget the name, Maidment. I think his first name was Gordon Maidment. Until I got to Grand Falls Station, I walked across Newfoundland from Port aux Basques to Grand Falls Station with a little suitcase. And I had it slung over my shoulder with a stick. But when I got to Grand Falls Station, Gordon Maidment said, look, You've come from Port aux Basques, and this is what, yes? I said, look, I've got something that you should have. And they went in his house and got it. It was a thing you strap around, you know, sort of a knapsack. And I think I threw away the little suitcase. And I had that for the rest of the way in.
Did you take a tent with you? Or
No. I slept indoors every night for the whole trip. It would be on the floor, it would be on a couch, it would be wherever they could put me up. When I got to the gaff topsails, there's a little shack there. And in that little shack, there was a young fellow. I guess he was the youngest employee of the railway. And he was sort of an apprentice, but he could operate the telegraph key, you see. They had to have someone there in case a train got in trouble. They had to get a word out, you see. And you can imagine what he thought as I walked up with this suitcase slung over my shoulder and tapped on the door, and he came. His eyes widened, you know, as he saw me. You know, who was I, where was I from, and so on. I said, can I come in? He said, yes, come in. And I told him the story. And I enlisted him in now while I was forming this union of section men, maintenance of waymen, they're called today, section men. I was helping to form to get members for the Order of Railroad Telegraphers, ORT, the Order of Railroad Telegraphers. They were one of the standard railroad brotherhoods of Canada and the United States and Newfoundland, but they didn't have too many members. And they asked me as I was crossing Newfoundland, would I talk to the operators and enroll as many as I could, and I brought along application forms, and I enrolled a fair number. One of the men that I enrolled at Gambo became many years later, became vice president, one of the vice presidents. We had 100 of them. Vice presidents of the Newfoundland Confederate Association. He was one of them. And he became a very, very important personality in that brotherhood. But anyway, this young fellow offered me his bunk, and I said, no, I'm not taking your bunk. And I slept on the floor on the gaff topsails. That young fellow, years later, was a very important railway operator. And the last place that I know him to be stationed in was Glovertown Station, railway station. And I ran into his daughter, a daughter of his years later. When I met him, he was just a young fellow, 16, 17 years old, you know. And many years later, I ran into his daughter. Oh, that was quite a trip. 3 months across Newfoundland. I walked a total of perhaps 700 miles, including the branch lines, maybe between 700 and 800 miles, and did it in 3 months.
How many groups of maintenance people did you visit?
I visited every section man in Newfoundland.
In a day, how many would you?
Oh, mostly about 4 a day, sometimes 8 a day, except when you'd get to Humbermouth, and then you'd get to Bishop's Falls, and then you'd get to Clarenville. You'd meet 30, 40, 50 people of a group. You know, because it was not only the section men, it was certain other workers of the railway that I could enroll and did enroll. I think there was one man in Newfoundland who refused to join the union. They paid 50 cents a man to join. That's all ever. Since I was born to this minute, that's all they ever paid was 50 cents a man. Not twice, not just once. When they joined, they paid 50 cents. And when I landed in St. John's, I didn't have a nickel of that 50 cents. They paid me perhaps just $400 maybe $400 in the period of 3 months. And I had to pay my board in a number of places. I did in Humbermouth. I paid my board in Bishop's Falls, and I paid my board in Clarenville, and I had to buy meals, and I had to buy food, you know, and I had to buy a couple of pairs of shoes. I wore out 3 pairs of shoes. So I landed in St. John's after 3 months, walking myself down to one Kentle. I landed in St. John's without one nickel, but that's not all. I landed in St. John's on a Saturday. And on the following Saturday, 1 week, I had out the first issue of a new weekly newspaper, the Labour Herald. And I sent that to every member of the union. And I sent it every week. Didn't charge them anything. I sent that every week because I sold enough other copies to pay the cost of printing the paper, you see. And the man who printed it for me was Dick Hibbs. And he was the owner of a daily newspaper called the Daily Globe. And Dr. Mosdale, the great journalist, was the editor of it. And he fell out with Hibbs and resigned his job and went to the Supreme Court and sued Dick Hibbs and got a judgment. But meanwhile, Dick Hibbs was left without an editor. And here was I going into the office every day to bringing stuff in for my weekly paper, you see. And he said, and we were old friends, he said, Joe, he said, how about coming on the Globe with me? Come on as editor. I said, you have an editor? No, he said, Mosdale has left. This is the great Dr. Mosdale, you know. And he's left? He said, yes. Well, I said, if he is left and there is a genuine vacancy, sure, I'll take it. He said, there's a genuine vacancy. And I took it. And that led to one of the great adventures of my life with Sir Michael Cashin. Because Mosdale sued the paper when he got judgment for the pay that he was demanding. When he got judgment from the court, he put an action in against he sued the paper, you understand, for the money. And Sir Michael Cashin, Peter Cashin, had a seat in the House of Assembly, and he was against the government. He had left the government. He had crossed the floor. And now he was up hammering hell itself out of the Monroe administration, you see. And now he made this big speech. And Sir Michael, his father, was determined that this speech would be published in full in the Daily Globe, you see, which was the opposition newspaper, you understand. And he came down to me, and I phoned him. I said, look, Peter's speech is not going to be in today. He said, why not? Why not? Because he was putting up some money to help keep the paper going, you know. So why not? I said, I'll tell you why. The Supreme Court won't allow us to print. The sheriff is here. He's taken possession of the building. And if you want to argue with him, come on down. He got in his car and drove down and came in the office. And there was the sheriff. And he said to the sheriff, show me, what have you got? And he showed him the document. And he had to pay $700 or $800 or $900, which was a lot of money then. And he paid the sheriff, and the press was ready to go. I had it all set up, ready on the press, ready to push the button, the press would start. So I had the man waiting, and as soon as he paid the sheriff, I nodded to the fellow. He went down, and the pressman pressed the button, and you could hear it was the floor below. You could hear the roaring of the press. And up he comes with half a dozen copies, the first they came off. And I handed one to Sir Michael. I said, here you are, Sir Michael. That's cheap. It's only $800 or whatever it was. It's only $800. You should frame it. That's the most expensive newspaper you ever read. Well, I sent that weekly newspaper free to every one of the union members. And then when I said to Dick, I said, look, Dick, I'll go on and edit your paper, sure, but I have my own paper, you know, I have to take care of it. He said, what do you mean you take care of it? I said, I owe it to these union members. He said, you owe it, what do they pay you? I said, never mind what they paid me, they paid me. And I've got to send them the paper. He said, I'll tell you what you'll do. 52 issues a year, a weekly paper, 52 issues. I'll send the Daily Globe daily to them for 52 issues. And he did. So the section men who joined my union paid every one of them 50 cents, except one who wouldn't pay. 50 cents a man. And I got them their pay, the 2.5 cents an hour, 10-hour a day. That's 25 cents a day. In the first 2 days, they got their 50 cents back. And I sent him the weekly paper for 3 or 4 weeks. Then I sent him the Daily Globe for, so many more weeks. So, but you know what happened? It was so successful that another gentleman, this is too good to let this thing die. And you know what he did? He went to Port aux Basques and he reorganized that union. This is months and months after, maybe 4 or 5 months after, maybe 6 months. He organized a new union and he collected $10 a man to join. And the first time I ran for the House of Assembly, I ran in the south side of Trinity Bay, and it was in Port Blandford. Big meeting in the night. The whole town was there at the meeting. Up gets a man. When I finished my speech, and I invited questions, I said, "You're the man that robbed the section man, aren't you?" I said, "No. No, I didn't rob them." "Yes," he said, "you're the man that went across Newfoundland and the section men drove you wherever you went on their hand cars and their speeders, and you collected $10 a man from them, aren't you? Aren't you ashamed?" Now here was a big audience. I was hoping they were going to vote for me. And here was somebody standing up, one of their own neighbors, a section man, and exposing me as a robber. I had fleeced the poor section man, So I said, "Sir, are you a section man?" He said, "Yes, I am." I said, "You should know what you're talking about." "Yes," he said, "I do." "How long have you been a section man?" "The last 3 months." I said, "Have you ever laid an eye on me before?" "No," he said, "I didn't see you when you went across." "No," I said, "you didn't see me then." And I said, "How much money did I take off you?" He said, $10. "You're sure it was I that took it?" He said, "Yes, you took it." "But," I said, "you only joined 3 months ago. Nobody took it from you. At least if somebody took it from you, it wasn't me. Because I went across here 6 or 8 or whatever it was, months ago." I said, "You never laid an eye on me before in your life." And then I told them the story, the audience, the story. And I said, months and months afterwards, after this gentleman, this your citizen here, after he became a section man, this other man went across Newfoundland and collected $10 a man. Boy, did she go up. They really gave me a reception. It was one of the most creditable things I ever did in my life. One of the finest things. It was hard work. To walk 800 miles, to wear out 3 pairs of shoes, to walk yourself down to 112 pounds to save their pay, the cut in their pay. That was a creditable thing. I was proud of it. And all I got for it was a bad name, for a while.
Okay, just about right on time.
Okay, that's good stuff. That's listenable anyway.
And a lot of it that